Well, good morning. It is our pleasure to be here. I want to start jumping right into this with something from George Washington. At the end of his presidency in 1796, he released what became known as the most significant political address ever given, the farewell address. And in his farewell address, he gave some of the most basic advice we could get as Americans, and a phrase you might remember, he said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity. And let me point out, as he's talking about political prosperity, he's not talking about other components and details that people might want to throw in. No, he's saying as a nation, right? Political prosperity, if we're going to succeed as a nation, he said, of all the things, of all the habits, of all the dispositions, all the things you could do, he said, this is the most important. Religion and morality are the indispensable supports. Indispensable means you can't do it without. So if there's one thing you cannot do and succeed as a nation, you can't remove religion and morality and think that you are going to politically prosper, he continued. He said, in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. Meaning, if someone is against religion and morality, they can't say they love their nation, because that's what a patriot is. A patriot loves their nation. He says, if you're against religion and morality, you don't love America. Well, this is a really interesting position to consider, because where we are today, we've seen things go a different direction, right? If you go back to the 1960s, when the U.S. Supreme Court said, wait a second, the case Engel versus Vitale, they said, we shouldn't have prayer in school. That wouldn't be appropriate for children. The following year, there was a dual decision. It was Abington Shimp and Murray Curlett. And in this decision, the U.S. Supreme Court said, and we really shouldn't have the Bible in schools anymore either. Those are things not appropriate for the education of children. The U.S. Supreme Court said, we don't need religion and morality. Now, George Washington said, you can't do it without religion and morality. But over the last 60 plus years, we have lived in a society that's decided we shouldn't have religion and morality, and maybe we should just try this American experiment without it. Well, if you haven't been paying attention, it's not working very well. But it's also interesting, if we go back and examine, why did the founding fathers suggest religion and morality were important? One of the founding fathers, Benjamin Rush, considered one of the most notable founding fathers. He signed the Declaration, helped ratify the Constitution, served under 3 different presidents. He was director of the U.S. Mint. He started the Sunday School movement in America, but he was also known as the father of public schools under the Constitution. And one of the things he did, because back then there was no Department of Education, and for those remembering, the Department of Education didn't exist until 1979. So this is a brand new concept in the idea of American education. So what did we do before that? Well, it was up to every state. And really, it was up to every local jurisdiction to deal with their schools. And so he said, well, there are some things we should have in common. One of the essays he wrote for public schools was an essay called The Bible in Schools. And what he argued is the one thing, all the colonies were unique, these states were different, but we're all working together. The one thing we should have in common is we should teach the Bible. That this should be the one thing we have in common. And actually, you can find this essay online. It's really worth reading. One of the things he acknowledges in this essay, he said, the great enemy of the salvation of man, in my opinion, never invented a more effectual means of extinguishing Christianity from the world than by persuading mankind that it was improper to read the Bible in schools. Now, he's just playing a little devil's advocate in this, and he says, hey, now there might be some people that say we shouldn't have the Bible in schools, right? Well, education, we should focus on reading and writing. We should focus on math and science. We don't need religion. And he says, that's a trick of the devil. Right? The devil's the one that wants us to remove the Bible from schools, because what's the point of learning to read and write? Well, if you go back to the early education laws in America, the reason we started public schools was to make sure our kids could read so they could read the Bible. It's actually part of the very first law, 1647. It was known as the Old Deluder-Satan Act, but this is his position going through. That the reason we had schools, if you go to 1844, the U.S. Supreme Court had a case that was known as Vidal versus Girard's Executors. And in this case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled a unanimous 8-0 decision that you could not be a public school, receive government funding, and prohibit the Bible, gospel ministers, evangelism from taking place on school campuses, because if you tried to hinder those things, you would lose your government funding. Because one of the things we were going to make sure our schools did in America was emphasize religion and morality, was teach the Bible in the very nature of what our schools did. Well, that's the way it was for a long time. And this is why Benjamin Rush also said the Bible, when not read in schools, is seldom read in any subsequent period of life. Now, this is an interesting thought. This is part of this essay that he wrote. But his argument is, if we're not teaching our kids to do the right thing when they're young, then how will they know to do the right thing when they get older? Now, just as an indication of this, This is a reality. Most of the habits we have in our life now, we formed when we were young. I would venture to say, if you did not learn to make your bed as a kid, your bed's probably not made right now. And everybody that chuckled, your bed's unmade, right? I know how this works. This is what's interesting. He said, we got to make sure our kids know the Bible, because if we don't teach it to our kids, then we can't expect them to know it as they get older. This was why it was part of education. Well, one of the great organizations out there, the American Bible Society, was actually started by the founding fathers. I don't have time to get into that story right now, but let me point out, every year they track the influence of the Bible or the state of the Bible in America. And in 2022, they found something quite shocking for the history of our nation and really the influence of the Bible. They discovered that in that year alone, 25 million people said they had stopped reading the Bible. Well, this was 2022. 2023, they came out with another study. That study, they found that in 2023, there were 3 million people that stopped reading the Bible. The following year, just last year, this report came out this year, they found that even last year, there were another 1 million people that stopped reading the Bible. Over the last 3 years, that is a decrease of 29 million Bible readers. Now, again, why does this matter? George Washington said, without religion and morality, no nation can succeed. Our political prosperity in America, it's built on religion and morality. And now we are at a place that people are saying we shouldn't read the Bible anymore. It's producing a biblically illiterate society. And this would be bad enough in culture in general, but where I see the bigger challenge is this happening inside the church. There's a lot of Christians who aren't even reading the Bible anymore. And again, let me connect these dots. Political prosperity, George Washington said, was built on religion and morality. A nation can't succeed, at least the American nation can't succeed, without the Bible, without religion and morality. And to give you a contrast, because most of us think of the Bible in context of the last 60 years, especially when it comes to education. But let me just give you a little compare and contrast. If you go back, for example, FDR, this is not all that long ago. FDR, he said, in the formative days of the Republic, the directing influence of the Bible, or the influence the Bible exercised upon the fathers of the nation is conspicuously evident, meaning it's obvious the founding fathers were influenced by the Bible. Now, how was this obvious? Well, if you look at the founding fathers and what they did, obviously, writing the Constitution was a big deal. Cornell Law School, they actually did a study to see how long do constitutions normally last. And what they discovered, in the history of the world, the average constitution lasts only 17 years. Our Constitution is 237 years old. Every September 17th, we set a new world's record for living the longest under a single constitution. No constitutional republic has lasted longer than we have. Well, this is an amazing success, yes. But it might be worth asking the idea, where did they come up with these ideas, right? If we look at the founding fathers, how did they come up with this? Well, there was a group of professors from the University of Houston, and they decided they wanted to go back and study the founding fathers and see what really influenced them and inspired what they did in creating the Constitution. And they said, okay, we're going to go through 15,000 representative writings. And from that, they found 3,154 quotes. It took them 10 years to do this. This was before the days of the internet. But what they discovered, they released in a book called The Origins of American Constitutionalism. In this book, they identified the greatest influences on the founding fathers according to the founders' own writings. So the people they quoted and cited the most. And what they said was the number one most cited individual was Charles Montesquieu. The number two most cited individual is William Blackstone. He did Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, very influential law book. Number three was John Locke. John Locke was the most quoted during the American Revolution, but they were looking at a 40 to 50 year period. Those were the three most cited individuals. But these professors said that wasn't the most cited source. They identified the most cited source. 34% of all the quotes from the founders' writings came from the Bible. To go further, they said we only included what was in quotation marks. Had we included all of the obvious references to the Bible, that number would have been far higher than 34%. Again, why does this matter? Because guess where they came up with the ideas for the American nation we have? The ideas came from the Bible. This is why Washington says religion and morality, this is where it all begins. And also, this is why it made sense. When former presidents said it's obvious the Bible influenced the founding fathers, it makes sense if you actually know history. And FDR even continued in that speech. He said, we cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic. He says, you can't even read history and not see how the Bible shaped America. Well, you can read most any history book today and you won't see that. But if you go back and study a little bit, let me give you an example. Do you know why we have the due process clauses in the Bill of Rights? If you actually go to the Federal Practice and Procedure, Volume 30, there's about 20 pages that explain why we have all these due process clauses in the Bill of Rights, and all of them came from the Bible. Because there were Christian ministers at the time looking at some of what was happening in the courts, and they said, this isn't the way courts should operate. Look at what the Bible says. They literally cite Bible verses for the due process clauses in the Bill of Rights. That's where it came from. This is why, if you know history, if you actually studied it, we would see how the Bible shaped our nation. Even President Teddy Roosevelt, he acknowledged the teachings of the Bible are so interwoven and entwined with our civic and social life that it would be impossible for us to figure what life would be if these teachings were removed. The Bible has so shaped life in America. If you remove the Bible, you wouldn't recognize America. Most Americans don't see this connection, but if we, example, take something like the free market, the free enterprise system. Why do we have that in America? Well, it actually started after our first two colonies, Jamestown and Plymouth. They explored with socialism, and it failed terribly. And both those colonies turned to the Bible and found evidences in the Bible of why they should change the individual responsibility. That became the birth and the foundation of the free market. There were many other Bible verses that influenced it, but even the idea of our republican form of government. Why did we start that? We started electing officials in the era of monarchs, and we started a republican system of government because the pastor of the Pilgrims, before the Pilgrims even come to the New World, he taught them that you have to do it different when you get to the New World. This is the influence of the Bible that is so obvious if you study history. In fact, even if you look at President's acknowledgement of the influence of the Bible, President Ulysses S. Grant, on the 100th anniversary of America becoming a nation, 1876, this was a card that was given to all of the children, all of the school kids in America. He said, this is something that all of our kids need to know. Now, what did he think our kids need to know? He said, hold fast to the Bible as a sheet anchor of your liberties. Write its precepts in your hearts and practice them in your lives. To the influence of this book, we are indebted for all the progress made in true civilization, and to this we must look as our guide in the future. Righteousness exalteth the nation, but sin is reproach to any people. He said every kid needs to know the Bible is the foundation. Hold fast to this thing. This is the one thing we have to have. This was given to school kids all over the nation, that this is the way we used to view the Bible. And yet today, we are living in one of the most biblically literate societies. And to give evidence, George Barton does all kinds of research and surveys. He identified it's only 4% of Americans that have a biblical worldview. Only 9% of Christians actually read the Bible on a daily basis. We can't even get Christians to read the Word of God anymore. And this is why we are seeing more biblical illiteracy than we've ever seen before in the history of our nation.
And that biblical illiteracy shows up in the way we look at God's institutions. We know that God has created three institutions. The first is that of the family. Genesis 1, 2, 3, God made Adam, made Eve, they had children. You have two genders and you have marriage. Now, genders, the less biblical we are, the less we understand that. If you don't know that there's two genders, just go to the helpful professors. Your helpful professors now point out there's 81 different genders. They're crazy. What happens, the Bible says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. If you doubt there's two genders, come to our ranch in Texas. I'll put you behind our cattle herd, and you're going to find there's only two genders. And it's really not that difficult to identify which is which. So the institution of family comes from the Bible. Also civil government. God created civil government, Genesis 9:6. God gave us what Hebrew scholars call the Noahide laws, 7 categories of civil laws. That's where we get, if there's a murder, capital punishment. That came from God, Genesis 9:6. That's civil government. The third institution is that of the church. We know that's also created by God. So when you look at those institutions, those 3 institutions that we have, Christians today know less about the Bible and government than they do about the other 2. Most Christians can handle, family and handle church. How about government? Well, this is not an issue in previous generations. Tim mentioned John Locke earlier. He was the third most cited individual. And John Locke was most cited, he said, in the founding era when we wrote the Declaration. As a matter of fact, Richard Henry Lee, he cites the fact that Richard Henry Lee used this book, the 2 treatises of government. So Lee said, the Declaration, we copied the Declaration from Locke's 2 treatises. So John Locke had great influence when we wrote the Declaration, and significant to that is that little book by John Locke is less than an inch thick, it's less than 400 pages long. That book references the Bible more than 1,500 times to show the proper operation of civil government. You challenge most Christians today, tell me Bible verses about government. They probably can't come up with 5 or 6 or 7, and yet the Founding Fathers used a book that cited it more than 1,500 times, 1,500 references. So this is where the institution is so significant. You look at the institutions that we have, we need to know what the Bible says about every one of them. As Christians, we need to get involved in the government area. We've walked away from that area in the last 40, 50 years, and somehow we think that's a secular area, and Christians don't do secular stuff. It is a biblical area. We would not have the government we have or the nation we have if we had not had the Bible to the base of that, and it's time for us to rediscover that. So the notion where Christians, we don't get involved in politics. Church doesn't do politics. That's a real problem, because if we don't, we won't have the nation we've had. The reason we have the nation is because we did get involved in politics. We did get involved in government. So what do we do now? Well, what we do now, there's several things. I'm going to go back to the cases that Tim mentioned, the Abbey and Shep, Mary Collette, take out the Bible and prayer in schools. And what happens in that, after we do that, the court simply said, look, we're not needing the First Amendment anymore. They were progressives, and that means they progressed past things. So we don't need the First Amendment anymore. And so what happened was people said, well, if we're not going to do prayer and Bible, then all of a sudden you had all these cases coming to the court challenging every religious activity in public, things that we've been doing for centuries. And they had so many come to the court that what happened was in 1971, they came up with what is called the Lemon test. Lemon versus Kurtzman is the case, and the court said, well, if you're wondering whether you can have a religious activity in public, here's a 3-pronged test we'll give you, and you don't have to sue and bring everything to the court. You just use this. And the number 1 prong, they said, in order for a religious activity to be constitutional, the primary purpose of that religious activity has to be secular. Now think that through. If it's constitutional, the primary purpose of religious activity has to be secular. Can you name a single religious activity whose primary purpose is no? And that's where we lost 7,300 federal court cases since 1971. You can't have prayer at schools, but you can't have prayer at graduation. You can't have prayer at baccalaureate. You can't even have a baccalaureate. As a matter of fact, you can't have all the stuff we've seen go out, nativity scenes, everything else, that's under the Lemon test. So what happens as a result of that is we suddenly get a new court. President Trump appointed justices, and they started reading the Constitution. As a result of reading the Constitution, we changed the position of the court on religion. A good example of that happened in 2019, the Bladensburg Cross case. This was a case where you had this World War I memorial where I think 25 kids have been killed in Maryland. The moms raised this cross to remember their kids, and it went to court because they said, you know, the primary purpose of a cross is not secular. And the lower court said that's exactly right. If you wanted to honor the kids, you could have raised a pyramid or a square or an orb or something else. You have a cross. If it wasn't a cross, it'd be constitutional, but the primary purpose of the cross is not secular. So they ordered the cross to be taken down, World War I memorial. When it got to the Supreme Court said, we don't really think that's the way it should be. Now, under the Lemon test, if we were to use the Lemon test, we would have to take this cross down, but the court said, we think there's a much better test, and this is what the court said. The court says, if something is a long-standing, religiously expressive monument, symbol, or practice, it requires a strong presumption of constitutionality. So what the court says is, look, if we've been doing this throughout our history, we're going to assume that it's constitutional. What we'd had to do for 60 years was, if it's religious, we're going to assume it's not constitutional. So the court completely flipped the presumption there, and as a result, they said, you're going to keep the cross. Then a case came in 2022, came out of Boston, Shirtlift. There are 3 flagpoles in front of Boston City Hall. One flag is the American flag, one the city flag, and the third is the people's flag. You can fly whatever flag you want there. Well, Camp Constitution, Massachusetts said, we want to fly the Christian flag because that's the flag of our camp. And the city of Boston said, no, you definitely can't fly a Christian flag. Well, they'd flown more than 200 other flags that were there, and suddenly you can't find a Christian flag. This went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, if we use the Lemon test, we would have to tell you can't fly that Christian flag because the primary purpose of a Christian flag is not secular. But they said that's crazy. As a matter of fact, the most liberal justice on the Supreme Court, I believe, in history, Justice Stephen Breyer, he said, we're not doing this. And this is what he said. He said the Lemon decision, the thing that we've been using for 60 years, he said that was issued during a bygone era when the court took a more freewheeling approach to interpreting legal text. In other words, they were activists. He said, we did that back in the days when we didn't read the Constitution anymore. And what happened was we got a 9-0 decision that said, yes, you will fly the Christian flag outside City Hall. You're not going to say no. So I'm saying all this to tell you the climate has changed. Most people don't know it. Most school districts don't know it. Climate has changed. To give you one more case, you may be familiar with the case that also was in 2010 2022 with Coach Kennedy. And the court at that time said, you know, we've been telling you about this lemon test. We're just knocking it off the books, and we're not going to use that anymore. So what they did in that decision was they vacated 7,300 previous decisions. By saying the lemon test is now bad law, 7,300 bad decisions are now gone. So the question, again, what do we do now? I think the best answer to that is found in Proverbs 21:22. Proverbs 21:22 says, a wise man attacks the city of the mighty and tears down the stronghold in which he trusts. Now notice, attack the city of the mighty. In other words, be offensive-minded. A wise man is offensive-minded. They go on the attack. We can do this now because of what's happened with the court and the changes that have happened in the court. We're able to put the 10 Commandments back in the schools now because that came down in the lemon test. You may be aware that places like Louisiana have passed a law that requires the 10 Commandments to be posted in every classroom. That can be done in every single state. I think there are 17 states now that are working on putting the 10 Commandments back up in classrooms. The same thing goes with memorial crosses. We had to take all those crosses down because they were a cross. No, we can put them back up now. Look for places to put crosses up because they now are constitutional again. In the same way, public invocations. Everywhere you go, you ought to ask people, can we open with prayer? Oh, that's no, it's not unconstitutional. You can open virtually anything with prayer, and school prayer is back in as well. I'll get to that in a minute. But nativity scenes, you know, we have a federal holiday, Christmas, to celebrate the birthday of Jesus Christ, but under the lemon test, we had to make Christmas a secular holiday. We had to have Santa Claus and Rudolph, and you can't have kids singing Christmas carols. You got to sing Jingle Bells. Not anymore. We can go back to having purity Christmas programs at public schools, and they can all be all about Christmas carols. We don't have to do that anymore. In the same way, when you get to things like in God We Trust displays, you ought to put in God We Trust up everywhere publicly you can. Do you know there's more than 700 counties now that have made that their county motto, not just the national motto? And as a result, they put in God We Trust in their fire cars, their police department, their fire truck, everything. We're back to God We Trust. Acknowledging God is really important. In the same way, student-led prayer, you can have prayer at your public school right now as long as a student leads it. If a student asks to lead prayer, that's fine. That's student religious expression. We're not at the point where teachers can lead prayers yet, but that may come. But at this point, you can have prayer back at schools. We ought to be having prayer at graduations again. If you got a kid in your church that is the valedictorian, he ought to start his valedictorian address with a prayer. And they're going to say, you can't do that. And he said, I just did that, and the court said I could. You'll win the case. See, what's going to happen is all the schools are going to say, you can't do that. And the kids have got to have enough backbone, which you have to train them to have backbone, and say, yes, we can do that. And I know some attorneys who would like to talk to you about this because we can win these cases now. So in the same way, you can teach the Bible in schools. You know there are 1,200 school districts right now that are teaching the Bible as a credit course in public schools. More than 200,000 students are using the Bible as their only textbook in that course. This is in public schools. This can be done. The same with creation science. You can go back to teaching creation again because that's not a theory. That is a scientific thesis. Most scientists today believe in some form of intelligent design. So the evolution thing is on the wane, and yet we still require that to be taught? Not anymore. So what I'm encouraging you to do is get offensive-minded, go back on the offense with this, and when you do, they're going to tell you can't do this. Your city council, whoever, you just send them to one of these legal groups. These guys love doing this for free. They're the ones winning these Supreme Court cases, and you just say, hey, Mr. Superintendent, I've got an attorney from First Liberty that really wants to talk to you. And at this point, so what we have to do is we have to go on the offensive. 7,300 things have been reversed. We need to go back. We need to be offensive-minded. I encourage you to do that. God bless you guys. Thanks for letting us share with you.